The story of Federation Forest began in the heart of a single woman who passionately believed in conservation. Jean Caithness, an Everett High School teacher in the 1920s and daughter of a timberman from Wisconsin, was such a person. Her family moved to Washington due to the lack of timber for harvesting in Wisconsin. When Jean later visited her home state, she was shocked to find all of the great old trees gone. This led her to foresee the same fate for the majestic Douglas fir of her new home. She wrote a poem and read it at a timber preservation meeting in her town.
I am king of the forest, Pseudotsuga taxifolia, the mighty fir tree. I was a tree when Columbus discovered America, and for hundreds of years I have been growing and growing, so that today I stand tall and straight and majestic, high above all other living things, reaching up into the sunlight and drinking in all the strength and purity of God's outdoors.
Jean Caithness asked to speak at the annual meetings of the women's clubs. She later became president of the Snohomish district. Her efforts paid off, and in 1922, the Federation of Women's Clubs adopted this resolution.
Resolved that the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs endorses state park activity and favors increased support for acquisition of scenic areas, especially virgin timber stands adjacent to main highways.
Esther Stark Maltby, the 16th president of the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs and liaison between the Federation and the Washington State Parks Commission, appointed Jean as forestry chairman.
Mrs. Maltby was a very, very quiet person, but had very definite ideas of what she wanted to achieve, and she could move the club women of the state of Washington to accomplish the founding of this special, wonderful park with all these beautiful trees.
The renowned conservationist and first director of the national parks, Stephen T. Mather, heard one of Jean Caithness's speeches. He generously handed her $500 of his own money to start on this noble project. Negotiations to purchase a 63-acre tract of virgin forest on the western slopes of Snoqualmie Pass were soon underway with the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company, a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser. In order to raise money for this endeavor, Save a Tree buttons and stamps were sold for $1 each. Later, bronze plaques to be engraved and placed on the donor's tree of choice sold for $100. With the help of some private donations, the women raised the funds within 2 years. At about that same time, Jean Caithness married Thomas Greenlees. On June 12, 1934, the day of the state convention, the Federation Forest was dedicated. Jean Caithness Greenlees was rightfully the first speaker, as it was her vision. Unfortunately, this tract of giants seemed doomed almost from the beginning. Out-of-control slashings on the western boundary burned several trees. Wind blew a large tree onto the highway, killing a traveler. After the story broke in the Seattle newspaper, the highway department ordered the parks to top a large number of trees. The accident actually happened outside the park boundary, but this fact came out too late to save the trees. Selective logging to the east brought about an inadvertent trespass where 22 of the park's giants were cut down. Esther Maltby wrote,
Then, tragedy of tragedies, the fierce storm of December 2nd, 1938, blew down 19 trees throughout the area, a few across the highway, and the park department was ordered to cut back all trees for 200 feet on each side.
The Park Commission advised the Federation to sell the land back to the lumber company for the $25,000 purchase price, as was agreed upon in the deed. The legislature passed a bill to place that money in a fund for acquisition of a new Federation Grove. In 1941, Secretary of State and Chairwoman of the Parks Department, Mrs. Belle Reeves, secured 251 acres of young growth on Chinook Pass across the Cascades. The White River Lumber Company, another subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser, owned the property west of the new site. They refused to sell even one more board foot of old-growth timber, leaving no buffer for unfriendly winds. The club women were very wary of this, having gone through the ordeal with the first park. With the onset of World War II, timber was at a premium, and hopes of acquiring the needed buffer zone dwindled. A change of fate was in the air, however, in what some of the women considered an act of God.
Otto Case was a good friend of ours too, because he was a land commissioner and at one time was the treasurer, and he worked very closely with the legislature to get the added funds.
Otto Case, treasurer of the State Land Commission and a long-standing friend of conservation, vaguely remembered a much-contested early ruling that set aside a small percentage of the gasoline tax for roadside protection. A sum of $125,000 went towards purchasing the needed 314 acres on the west end of the park. In all, the process of realizing the vision of Jean Caithness Greenlees took nearly 3 decades. The new Women's Federated Forest State Park was dedicated on July 16, 1949. Jean Caithness Greenlees, who passed away shortly after the dedication of the first park, was honored with a 1/5 acre grove in her name. Esther Maltby.
Dr. Frank Warren, president of Whitworth College in Spokane, and also chairman of the State Parks Commission, gave an eloquent expression of appreciation, only exceeded by that of Governor Langley. Mrs. Maltby tried to answer the question, why save a forest? And then, surprise of surprises, the monument was unveiled. Mrs. E. Cowan, a past state president of the Federation, asked permission of the newly elected executive, who was presiding, to include another dedication. With heavenly words which can still make me weep with happiness, she announced that the full board of the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs had voted to honor Mrs. H. E. Maltby by dedicating to her a trail in this grove, whereon should be erected a bench of native stone, so that any who trod that way might rest and meditate in this peaceful forest primeval, only one of its kind in the park system of Washington or elsewhere, so far as we know.
We have come to know and appreciate the rangers that have served in this area. And we just give so much credit to people who have served over the years, and people like Fred Clater, who there's a wonderful trail through the park that's named for him. And he was very responsible to keep the club women in touch with Miss Montgomery.
Fred Clater wrote,
At about the turn of the century, there were in Bellingham 2 bosom companions, Ella Higginson, a composer of fine verse, and Catherine Montgomery, an educator, both members of the Federation and lovers of Washington's majestic forests. With the passing of Ella Higginson, a cash bequest was entrusted to Miss Montgomery, who used it for the purpose of purchasing what is now the Ella Higginson Grove. This donation was in addition to the Federation Forest, fronted by and protecting a magnificent grove of virgin firs.
Ms. Montgomery bequeathed $87,000 to the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs to be used for improvements to the park. Today, the Catherine Montgomery Interpretive Center details the contrasts in nature in Washington State. Exhibits in and around the center highlight the diversity of our state through pictures, text, wood relief, samples, and living displays. Visitors who stop on their way to Mount Rainier often use the center as an information tool. The Catherine Montgomery Interpretive Center was dedicated to the park on September 20th, 1964, 8 years after her passing. In 1974, the name of the park was changed to Federation Forest State Park. The legacy left by the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs and their continued support for this park can be seen in the face of every schoolchild. Students from all over the Puget Sound region enjoy their field trips to this park. Visitors from all over the world pass through here each year in awe at the magnificence of the grand old trees of Federation Forest State Park. Comments written in the guest register speak volumes on the value of this noble endeavor begun so long ago by the wisdom of a few good women.
It just shows what people who want to conserve the riches of the past, that they can be preserved for the generation that to come, can enjoy this wonderful place.